But tonight we're talking, looking back over 50 years of the Fitzrovia news. It's amazing that it has survived so well in an area where there's been so much change over that time. And I look forward to hearing some of the stories that's come out about it. Nick Baily is well known to the Society because he produced a publication on Fitzrovia and has actually talked to us before. But we also have Sue Blundell and Linus Rees. Now, if you could save your questions to the end, because we're not using chat this time, and over to the speakers now, please.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, and many thanks to the Camden History Society for inviting us to make this presentation. We're talking about the contribution of community newspapers to recording and disseminating local history. So we're trying to link the community newspaper that we know best, which is the Fitzrovia News, with ideas about local history, which I'll come on to at the end of the presentation. But we've all been involved in various ways. Well, certainly Sue and I have been involved for getting on for 50 years, both in writing and, well, mainly in writing, actually. And Linus has very nobly been helping with the production and the distribution, and also has written several articles himself as well. So we've all been heavily involved in the newspaper, and we will say a bit about it and open up the discussion for questions. First of all, I just wanted to thank several people for their noble contribution. Tudor Allen has been very helpful, and we've had access to Camden's local history archive for both images and scanning, and I managed to trade some old photographs I had for scans of those photographs and other ones from his archive, which reduced the cost quite considerably. So we're very grateful to his support. We managed to get some funding from the City of Westminster, because, as I will explain, Fitzrovia covers both sides of the borough boundary. And so I would particularly like to thank West End ward councillors, which is our ward, Fisher, Lilly and Toll have been very supportive throughout. And last but not least, Drew De Soto of a company called Navigate, which is just around the corner from us in Charlotte Place, who gave his time and expertise in designing and laying out the publication. So that the whole thing would not have been possible without his pro bono gift of a lot of time in putting the whole thing together. He said he did enjoy it, and it made a massive change from producing annual reports for the Cooperative Society and banks and such like. So he was quite pleased to be involved, I think. And obviously we'd also like to thank all the contributors, Paddy O'Connell for writing an introduction, and all those who whether they knew it or not, had their articles from the Neighbourhood News reproduced in the 50th edition. What we're going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about Fitzrovia and the origins of the newspaper. I know you've had several lectures and several talks on Fitzrovia. There are a lot of publications. In fact, the Camden History Society produced a very good one themselves on Fitzrovia. So hopefully quite a lot is known about the history and the culture and the activities of Fitzrovia. Linus, secondly, will then talk about the production and funding of the paper and how it's evolved, and how he's been setting up the archive with Pete Wyatt particularly, and that's all online, and he'll give you a link if you need to have a look at it later on. Sue will come on thirdly with some stories that we've produced and published in the paper over the years. And I will end with a bit of discussion. Being an academic or former academic, I will say a bit about how I see community newspapers contributing to local history. So that's the format. For those who don't know, a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Fitzrovia. We always see it as being roughly half and half, divided between Westminster and Camden. It's the Camden side lies in Bloomsbury and normally goes up to, we normally assume Gower Street is the easterly boundary. Oxford Street is the southern boundary, and on the Westminster side, Great Portland Street is the westerly boundary, and the Euston Road is the northern boundary. The dividing line between the two boroughs is Cleveland, mainly Cleveland Street, but then it wiggles behind various properties. representing the different parishes that were combined, or no, not combined, the two parishes, and it was an ancient parish boundary, and the boundary between St Pancras and Marylebone before reorganisation of local government. So it's basically an area that's community defined. In other words, we've over the years projected what we consider to be the image of Fitzrovia based on people's perceptions, so very much based on residents and businesses who see themselves as being part of Fitzrovia. As you can see, we're surrounded by Soho, which is a very different atmosphere. Anyone who's fought their way through Soho on a Saturday night and then cross Oxford Street into Fitzrovia, you suddenly realise things are much quieter and more peaceful. So there's a big difference there. Marylebone on the west side. Westminster always liked to call Fitzrovia East Marylebone until quite recently, and they've begun to change and they've begun to use Fitzrovia. And on the the eastern side, Bloomsbury and the Bedford estate. A population of roughly 10,000, quite a large student population, which is included in that number. And we've always promoted ourselves as being south of the Euston Road, and often we sometimes feel that Camden Council kind of overlooks us because, you know, we're just part of the West End and we can therefore be ignored in terms of affordable housing and community open space and such like. So we've always promoted ourselves as being South Euston Road, but a living community with two halves divided between two boroughs. Main employers are health and medical services. Obviously, UCLH is very close. The Middlesex Hospital was on the Westminster side, but has since merged with UCLH. Design and architecture are very prevalent in terms of office use. TV and film relating to the BBC, IT and games, online games, and there's universities and the British Telecom Tower. I have no idea how many people are employed there, but probably quite a lot. As you will know from past books and talks, in the past, Fitzrovia was totally different in terms of its industrial activity, and it was very much industrial. Furniture making, pianos were first made in Wimble Street before moving north to Camden Town. Clothing, the rag trade, particularly on the Westminster side, fed into the department stores in Oxford Street. Cars is an unusual one. Great Portland Street used to be the place where you went for posh car showrooms in the pre-war period. And in the post-war period, anyone who wandered down Warren Street in the 60s and 70s were confronted by rather shady used car dealers who somehow managed to persuade the parking wardens to let them put their used cars on the street without paying any fines. Advertising, Saatchi and Saatchi had a massive building in Charlotte Street, and that's been redeveloped. So things have changed, but we're very much into the technical design and media industries in general. So just a very brief run through some of the history. It developed as part of the Southampton and Cavendish Harley estate. So the Camden side was part of the Southampton estate, and Cavendish Harley dominated on the western side. I can't read that date. Is it 18?
Sorry,
I'm just something over there. That's it. But the crucial change, I think, in terms of Fitzrovia, it's always had a rather sleazy, down market atmosphere until quite recently, anyway. And that very much relates to the history of ownership. And the fourth Baron Southampton sold Fitzroy Square and surrounding area from about 1875. His father, the third Baron, was totally committed to fox hunting in the Midlands and had no interest whatsoever in his London estates, and simply lived off the proceeds. And when he died, his son just simply sold off the estate as freehold land, which meant that no single owner predominated. So there was no sale to another big estate or to the Bedford estate, for example. It was simply each property was sold off individually, which meant that there was no kind of overall control, unlike the Bedford estate, which managed uses, appearance, design, all aspects of the use of the property. On the west side of Tottenham Court Road, there was no such control at all. Cavendish Harley tried to redevelop some of the estate in the pre-war and mainly pre-war period, but then sold off a large chunk east of Great Portland Street in the 1920s, because they felt that there wasn't much future in those days. Amazingly enough, they felt there was no commercial future in a rather sleazy, rundown part of London, which was mainly involved in the rag trade and clothing making and such like. So that's really, I think, why Fitzrovia became the haunt of bohemians, of people renting single rooms, of restaurants moving into shops without any kind of control at all, lack of bathrooms, lack of facilities generally. And when the Fitzrovia Neighbourhood Association was set up, we did various housing surveys on both the Westminster and the Camden sides, and the level of overcrowding, lack of facilities, sharing of rooms was just unbelievable in terms of current circumstances, current standards. And gradually things have changed. There have been some housing action areas, general improvement areas, and the housing has gradually improved. But I think it goes back to the fragmentation of the two estates, which meant that owners could do whatever they liked with the property. And it became, therefore, a reception area for migrants of all sorts. And I think it was Peter Ackroyd who said that London's always been a city of migrants. It's not a city of kind of people being indigenous. And at least since the 1870s, and perhaps even the 1848 revolution in France, migrants have been coming into Fitzrovia in particular. I think, again, because of the cheap property, relatively cheap property. You could rent a room for very little in those days, and you could work in a restaurant, you could work in the rag trade, you could do all sorts of other things in the local industries. So pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, the Paris Commune was, Fitzrovia was called Little France at one stage because there were so many French people in the area, and there were schools, soup kitchens, libraries, specifically aimed at the French population. And we've also had waves of migrants from Italy, Cyprus, Germany, Bangladesh, China, and probably a number of other countries as well. So it's always been that kind of reception area, which created a very kind of fertile cultural context which people could operate in. And of course, the Fitzroy Tavern was a major attraction. Schmidt's, which is, there's an article in the 50th edition, which is a German restaurant. There were loads of Greek, Cypriot kebab houses and Italian restaurants, and certainly Indian restaurants as well. So that kind of cultural mix, I think, largely came out of the way the property was divided up, sold off, and sublet and managed or not managed at all. The identity developed in the 1970s. Fitzrovia was not a term that was well known or used very much, although Tom Dryburgh is supposed to have invented it in the 1930s over a pint in the Fitzroy. But it was never used kind of in terms of administration or in terms of public bodies. And from the 1970s, we had the newspaper that we're talking about now, a festival that was first organized in 1973. And thanks to something called Urban Aid, we managed to get some funding from central government, from the Home Office, to set up a information centre and advice centre in Tottenham Street. So that kind of consolidated the identity, if you like, those three developments in particular. So the characteristics of Fitzrovia: it's a dense, mixed use, very diverse population. I can't read that word, low cost, but overcrowded, known for pubs and restaurants. Obviously today that low cost is highly questionable, because anyone who tries to buy a flat in Fitzrovia finds you start by having to pay £1 million, and then anything above that is quite normal. So things have changed enormously in terms of the private property. There's still quite a large amount of about 25 to 30% of affordable socially rented housing from housing associations and the bohemian past, again coming out of this diversity, this migration of different cultures and people wanting to mix together and work together artists, writers, composers, political activists. The Paris Commune, for example, sent over or enabled a number. As a result of the Paris Commune, a large number of anarchists came over, and there were various anarchist clubs and societies hidden away in the back streets of Fitzrovia. The adoption of the name Fitzrovia came much later, in the sort of late 1970s, I would say, and both Camden and Westminster. Camden, I think, adopted it first for sort of planning purposes. There was a neighbourhood plan in the 1980s called Fitzrovia, and Westminster followed suit a bit later in probably the 1990s. And indeed, the first paper was actually called Tower. It wasn't called the Fitzrovia News, because Fitzrovia was not recognised by most people in 1973 when it all started. Just to give you an idea of the diversity, these are just 2 or 3 shots of organisations, outfits, shops that existed in the past. On the left, a shop in Grafton Way. Grafton Street became Grafton Way. I'm not sure when the change took place, but there was the Bombay Emporium, which sold all sorts of specialities, which you would probably find now in Drummond Street or somewhere further north in Camden Town. And on the right, Sue will talk a bit more about Agnes Marshall, who ran a very interesting establishment in Mortimer Street, 1332 Mortimer Street, selling things like curry powder and other exotic ingredients, which must have been quite a shock at the time. In the middle is a plaque celebrating what I think must be the first Nepalese restaurant. I'm not quite sure why it was placed on 145 Whitfield Street, because in fact, when I first moved into the area, that part of Whitfield Street was well known for organisations like the Agra, which was a well-known Indian restaurant, and I don't remember any Nepalese there, but somebody might know the answer to that question. Where it all started in 1970, in the early 1970s, the only facility in Fitzrovia, the only kind of public facility, was this small single-storey building that may have been built in the war or may have been built just after the war, I'm not sure why, which was called the Whitfield Play Centre. And it was a sort of nursery, but not a very organised nursery. But we were allowed to hold meetings there. And that was really the only place that meetings could be held. And believe it or not, we had 2 community workers based in Fitzrovia, which, you know, is a complete luxury, because I think the job of community worker doesn't really exist anymore. I've not come across any recently anywhere in Camden. We had 2, and they were instrumental in setting up the newspaper group and motivating people to organise a festival as well. And that's explained in the publication. Amazing contribution, really, from 2 people who probably just thought, oh, we'll just organise a meeting and see who turns up, and, you know, if they want to have a festival, we'll help them find a way of doing it. But really, from those initial meetings, things really took off. I think the 70s were a period of community action, community activity. There were loads of advice centres all over Camden and festivals happening all over Camden as well. And we simply joined the gang. It's now a nursery run by the Fitzrovia Trust, or leased by the Fitzrovia Trust, and there's a pocket park next door which anyone can go and play in. It's got new play equipment just arrived. That in the back is the Whitfield Church, which fronts onto Tottenham Court Road. So you've got Tottenham Court Road on the left and Whitfield Street on the right. So that's over to Linus to talk about production and funding. Linus has got to put his slides up. You have to put yours down.
Thanks, Nick, for that introduction. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is how Fitzrovia News developed from the Tower. As Nick said, it started off as a Tower. Fitzrovia wasn't a name in common use at that time. I'm going to talk about how the paper was produced, and then I'm going to talk about how it evolved to an online news site, and how we developed a publicly accessible archive, how we funded the paper, and how we eventually became a digital first production and began publishing on a very small budget. So this, the first 3 decades of the paper, everything was done by using a typewriter, typing up columns of text, pasting them to a board, and sending them off to the printers, where they probably use a technique called photostating. Often the paper would be have columns handwritten. This example from December 1975 was actually produced in English, Chinese, Bengali, Greek, and Spanish. It was 16 pages, and we had this 4-page supplement in the middle, explaining what was going on in the neighborhood in these different languages. So that was quite something, something we no longer do. But this has been a theme throughout the sort of early years, and indeed the early decades of Tower, which then became Fitzrovia News. It was all done, I mean, quite painstakingly, and it wasn't until the 1990s that we actually started using a computer to type the columns of text, but it was still done using cut and paste. So all this would have still been done, the same process, bits of paper stuck to a board, sent off to a printers, probably in East London. When I first got involved, we were using a company called East End Offset, and you can see here we say where it's actually printed. It wasn't until December, relatively late, because a lot of papers, this page will, this finally arrived. This was the first edition that we actually produced using desktop publishing software. So I think we had a copy of Quark, I think I'm pronouncing it Quark or Quark, Quark Express, not Quorn Food. And so this is what it looked like then. Looked a bit more professional, and a little note here saying, does it look different? Sorry, I went to click on something and I didn't intend to. In 2007, we started producing a paper in full color, and we eventually settled on this sort of format, and 3 of us edited it. Mike Pentelow, sadly no longer with us, Pete Wyatt, who's here tonight, and myself. And it was quite a labor of love. And a few years later, we developed a website. The first articles went online. And then a few years later again, we developed the public archive site. So all of Tower is on the archive, and anyone can go and look at it. It's indexed by date. It's not yet searchable. We have to add some summary text to make it searchable. But people do, browse the editions, and it's a useful source of information. People who used to live in the area moved away. Some people, get a lot of readers from America, from Australia, all over the world, and they tell us they enjoy looking at the old papers, and sometimes they've contributed to these historic editions. By June 2011, we'd sort of improved our quality production. We had a new computer, and we're also able to produce a PDF file, so that people could download the whole paper in quite good quality, from if they weren't living in London or couldn't pick up a paper locally, they could read the whole printed paper. And we very much prioritized putting news and features in the paper first, and then they went online afterwards. The point being, we were trying to sell advertising, so obviously we wanted people to pick up the paper, and so our advertisers would be happy and would part with their cash. It was costing quite a lot to produce the paper. It was a huge amount of effort, and to produce 16 pages and a print run of about 6,000 copies, which were delivered by, we had a group of volunteers. They would go deliver to all the households in Fitzrovia and leave piles of papers in cafes and restaurants, friendly shops. And that was costing us about £1,000 to produce. But it was heavily subsidised by the Fitzrovia Neighbourhood Association with free use of an office. And we also had a grant to buy a computer and the latest version of desktop publishing software. All that came to an end. First, we lost the neighbourhood centre in 2019. And then sadly, in 2020, Mike Pentelow died very suddenly, and we were left without Mike, who wrote pretty much half the paper, or at least cajoled people into contributing articles for the paper. So that was a great loss. And we had no real choice then but to switch to a digital first production, where the website and an email newsletter became the main vehicle of people reading the paper. So all the articles would go online. We'd send out an email newsletter, usually twice a month. And then every 3 months, we carry on the tradition of producing a quarterly printed newspaper. But it's a shadow of its former self. We only produce 2 pages in black and white. And it's really just there for people who want to pick up. And we don't produce many copies of these, and we don't deliver them door to door. We just leave them at the community centre for people to pick up and read. It really just contains a digest of stuff we published over the preceding 3 months. Occasionally we produce a special edition, like this one, where we did a story on Clarion housing, and we try to get people to submit comments to Camden Council about the quality of housing. So we've done these sort of special editions every now and then. And again, the paper can be, downloaded and read online all over the world. So really, as a newspaper, it pales into comparison what we were producing 5 years ago, where we were, printing something with a lot of information, a lot of features about the neighbourhood, thanks to Mike Pentelow. And at the same time also producing a website. So it was costing us about £5,000 in 2019 to produce a printed newspaper 4 times a year. Now we're only spending we're spending less than £500. And so it's a considerable saving. It's much easier to produce. And times have changed. Most local newspapers are no longer available in print. The exception in Camden is with the Camden New Journal and its sisters papers, the Islington Tribune and the West End Extra. They're still being produced in print, and they're very much a print first publication, unlike ourselves. But what we're doing now is an affordable way of doing it, but it really doesn't. People enjoy reading the the printed newspaper. And many people say to us, when we're going to have another 16-page full-colour paper? Well, not in the near future. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that aspect of it. I'll hand over to Sue now, who will talk about some of the features we've had in the paper.
Okay, thank you for coming, everybody. I'm just going to give a very quick rundown, first of all, on the types of articles we've had in the paper over the years. All of these themes are, or nearly all of them are local, focused on Fitzrovia and the surrounding areas. So first of all, characters and pets, both living and dead. Characters, I must say, feature much more than pets, but we do have our fair share of pets. Mainly cats, I think, but there are quite a few notable dogs as well. As Nick was saying earlier, Fitzrovia has always really, for well over 100 years, been known for its pubs and its restaurants, some very famous ones like Bettorelli's and Schmidt's and so on. And it still is very much an eating and a drinking area. We're proud to say that only one of the pubs I think I'm right in saying only one of the pubs in Fitzrovia has actually closed. They're all still going, thank goodness. Of course, politics, planning, housing and amenity issues, culture, media and sport, to coin a phrase, local history, and finally, shops and businesses. I'm not going to attempt to talk about all of those themes. I'm just going to give you a few examples. Amongst the characters in the area, he's already been mentioned and really badly missed. I think quite a few of you will know him because he was a member of the Camden History Society as well and went to a lot of meetings in Holborn Library. That's Mike Pentelow, who was involved in the paper right at the beginning and went on to edit it and sadly died during the COVID crisis. Mike was also the author with Marcia Rowe of a much loved book called Characters of Fitzrovia. And I should just say, I won't go through all the people on the right, but in the picture on the left, Mike is posing outside of the much missed Fitzrovia neighbourhood centre, and that's a mural, and the characters there from left to right are Equiano, who was a freed slave who settled in Fitzrovia and became an abolitionist, involved in the campaign to abolish slavery, and also became quite a well-known writer. To the right of him is Simon Bolivar, who lived here briefly, the liberator of South America. Then Bernard Shaw, who famously lived in Fitzroy Square, and his head is rather beautifully balanced over Mike's. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, where she should be as a woman, I say, ironically, is Mary Stopes, who founded her famous birth control clinic on Whitfield Street. And it's still there, not in exactly the same place, but it's still on Whitfield Street. And that's Mike's book on the right. This is an example of an article by Mike, which was published in 2010. And it's actually a book review. He was reviewing a book called An Underworld at War, Spivs, Deserters, Racketeers and Civilians in the Second World War, written by someone called Donald Thomas. And it's an account of a lot of gruesome things, dodgy dealings that happened in Fitzrovia during the war. And what I've highlighted there, the killing of a 43-year-old prostitute, Margaret Lowe, at a flat in Gosfield Street, which is on the Westminster side of the boundary. She was strangled and mutilated by a young airman, Gordon Cummins, on February 11th, 1942. He murdered 4 women in 4 days during the blackout, and he went on to be hung, as it says at the end there, during an air raid. I must just say there that Mike Pentelow was the kindest, gentlest, sweetest man you could ever hope to meet, and he loved all this stuff. He really reveled in it, and he wrote a regular article or regular feature for the news on murders in the area, and there seem to have been quite a few of them, I must say. This is an item from the same article, in fact, something that happened during the war. A local man, someone living in Fitzrovia. I find this absolutely amazing, I must say, but he regularly visited London's zoo and was allowed to take animals that had recently died and then eat them. It is quite incredible that they allowed that. Goodness knows what the animals had died from. But in May 1942, for example, he turned a 4-foot crocodile into a casserole and said it was jolly good, tasting like veal, but a little stronger. He also consumed giraffe neck, elephant trunk, coipu rat, camel, porpoise, seal, wild cattle, deer, and antelope. Brilliant. And that was the cartoon which accompanied the article in the Fitzrovia News. I think Pippa Williams is still a cartoonist and quite well known, but at the time he did a lot of cartoons for the news free of charge. Time he was living in Fitzrovia, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't live there now. Anyway, that's his, if you can't read it, food rationing laws, 1 crocodile per person. And something else Mike wrote about was, well, the reason I put this in actually was because we used to have a police station on Tottenham Court Road, and we're not absolutely sure when it closed down, but Nick thinks about 20 years ago. But it was actually, strangely, a bit reassuring to have a police station. And we also had our local community policeman who was called, we loved him, he was called Stanley Baldwin. He was such a character, he was great. Anyway, that's about another murder which you could read about there, when 3 young men sadly actually broke into Jay's Jewellers in Charlotte Street and murdered the owner, and they were hung too, and they were just young lads messing around really. But that's Tottenham Court Road police station there. I was just looking up this crime, just in passing. This is an Australian newspaper, actually, but they reported this crime. I put it's where the arrow is. On that sunny April morning, 3 young men in raincoats were seen outside a little jewellery store in Wayside, Charlotte Street, Tottenham, a London suburb. So that's what happens when you get papers produced in Australia about Fitzrovia. We get moved to Tottenham. Clive Jennings, who is here tonight, I think, is our arts editor and has been, I think, for quite a few years. He's also an artist himself, as it says there, an art dealer, a curator. And he has written, Clive will know better than I do, but for over 10 years, he's been writing articles about the art scene in Fitzrovia. And of course, as Nick said, a lot of artists used to live in the area, and there are now quite a lot of galleries here. I think when Cork Street went down the drain a bit a few years ago, Fitzrovia began to take over, and quite a lot of galleries opened then. This is an article which Clive wrote during lockdown, and I must say this was news to me. But as he says, it's been a very difficult year for London's art galleries, as they are classified as shops and therefore were closed until the 4th of July. And of course, and they were closed again during the second lockdown later in the year. But happily, as Clive points out, most Fitzrovia galleries have a sophisticated online presence that is worth looking at, and they certainly do. Thank God for the internet, I say. And this is from the same article. A big bonus for Fitzrovia residents was the free sculpture on our doorstep in October. The highlight for me of this alfresco offering was the magnificent 6-meter high plait of hair made of mild steel rods by London-based artist Calliope Limos. I must, just to echo that, it was I actually wrote an article about this for the paper, that it was during lockdown, we decided, or I in particular decided, that Regent's Park had to be counted as part of Fitzrovia, because you did meet more of your neighbours in Regent's Park than you met in the streets of Fitzrovia. It was a very, very nice bonus to the lockdown. There were many, but that was one of them. And I did myself, I took this photograph of the plait of hair, which meant I loved it. I agree with Clive. It's the most beautiful one. And if you're a woman, or a particular woman who grew up in the 1950s, as I did, we had long plaits. And then when it was this kind of coming of age thing where, I think I was 13 when it happened to me, your mother said, oh, I've had enough of this, washing all this hair. And she just cut it off. And we kept it for years, actually, but I don't know what's happened to it now. But that really did seem very meaningful to me, that plait. This is another article by Clive. This was also, of course, during lockdown. Wash hands, go home, die. And that was from an exhibition which was put on by the Cartoon Museum, which is still on Wells Street. Very, very good place. Nick showed you this slide earlier. I mentioned Agnes Marshall. I'll have to be very quick here, but Agnes Marshall was a lady who ran a cookery school on Mortimer Street, which is in the Westminster side, and it was a very, very popular cookery school. Thousands of people trained there, and she was a celebrity chef, and she toured the country on the train network, giving cookery demonstrations. She was famous for her iced puddings, and she is reputed to have invented the ice cream cornet, because, as you may know, up until the late 19th century, we used to eat ice cream sold on the street from glass vessels called penny licks, which were dipped in water and then used for the next customer. And the cornet was, the ice cream cornet which you ate was a big improvement on that. I wrote about Agnes Marshall myself in an article which Linus chivied me into write, called Safe Spaces for Working Women, Mortimer Street in late Victorian and Edwardian times. Linus was particularly interested in this building, which is on Mortimer Street. It's called Ames House, and it was the first, what's the expression I'm looking for? Purpose-built. It was the first purpose-built YWCA hostel in London, and they were very proud of it, and rightly so. I think it had 97 rooms, or cubicles, but every cubicle had its own window, and if it was a cubicle, it was curtained off, and they had splendid facilities. So they had ironing rooms and washing rooms and a canteen and so on and so forth. All this, as I must say, when I started looking at Mortimer Street and realizing that a place like this, it was built in 1904, and it was designed by the architect Bannister Fletcher. Sorry, not Bannister Fletcher, Beresford Pite. Thank you, Nick. Beresford Pite, who did quite a lot of work in the Camden area. And I began to realize when I was researching it that Mortimer Street at that time, so late 19th, early 20th centuries, was full of women, because a lot of businesses on the street were run by women. There were dressmaking establishments and milliners, and there were also restaurants set up just for women. And a lot of this, of course, was to do with the fact that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a lot of women were coming into employment for the very first time. And the West End, Fitzrovia, attracted them because of the department stores on Oxford Street and the rag trade places in Fitzrovia. And there was a pressing need for housing for these women. And that was supplied by establishments like Ames House. But by no means the only one. Actually, there were lots of hostels for women in the area at that time. It's very interesting. So Mortimer Street's just a paradise for women, I think, at the time. Well, not a paradise, but it was very much populated by women. And this is the woman, Mrs. Cooper Oakley, who founded a series of restaurants called the Dorothy restaurants, again for working women in the West End, for women, as she said herself, for women who can't bear to have men around the place. And they were women-only restaurants. And I wrote this article at a time when there was a lot of news about violence against women, understandably, and it did seem terribly relevant. Okay.
Right, very briefly, a set of conclusions. I think one of the interesting things about a community newspaper is how the articles get selected and written. And I think it was partly chivying from the wonderful editors, Mike Pentelow, Linus, and in the past, at the very beginning, 1973, we had Patrick Ensor, who actually worked for The Guardian, and he was the sort of motivating editor, and he was very good with his partner, Judith Thomas, getting people to write things. And things that got written were very much sort of personal interests and ideas that people came up with and said, how about putting something about this in, or some immediate event which had to be kind of recorded. So it was a haphazard process, but it was a very sort of, in the end, it seemed very structured. And if you look at previous editions of the paper, it's a very wide range of reportage and discussion about all sorts of different topics. The immediate planning issues or housing issues, and also the cultural factors, famous people who lived in the area, famous events and such like. So just running through this list, firstly, I think it enabled, the newspaper helped create a sort of image and identity for the area, because everybody got a copy. It's several thousand, thousand copies got printed and distributed by a lot of eager volunteers who went round distributing the paper, and it created a kind of community identity that sort of existed, because people identified some of the shops and restaurants in Fitzrovia, but it had no name at that time in the early 70s, and that gradually emerged over time. Secondly, it captured stories of past events, residents and businesses. And I'm sure you're aware from this and previous talks that the sort of depth of activity and interest going back over at least 2 centuries, if not more, to the late 18th, when most of it got built, and the 19th onwards. The number of people who lived in the area of great interest and of character and relevance is enormous, and you just need to look at Mike Pentelow's book to see the range of people. So it was the newspaper was a way of capturing people's interests and people researching topics and people, and then writing up a short article which was then published in the paper. Interviews with long-term residents, and some people did deliberately picked people of an age, people who'd lived in the area a long time, people who had a lot of local knowledge that went back to when we, I think, first started, way before the war, to the 1930s. I remember somebody talking about the so-called health service in the 1930s, where you had to pay the doctor before he would even look at you. Those kinds of stories were, really interesting to most people who, were brought up under the NHS. So it's a form of capturing oral history, because you interviewed, you asked people questions. What did you do? What was your job in the area? How long have you lived here? What was your experience of working and living in the area? That sort of basic question was a very good way of capturing oral history. Fourthly, it projects an image to the local authorities. And I said earlier on that the word Fitzrovia kind of gradually crept into common usage, probably towards the end of the 1970s and then onwards from then. And it was only reluctant by the local authorities at a later date. And it was a way also of projecting kind of local priorities and local and unique features of the area, things which needed protecting, listed buildings that were crumbling and falling into disrepair, streets that were overcrowded and overrun with parking. Just the issues of that kind could be reported, and we made sure the local authorities got copies of the paper, and they hopefully picked up the tenor of local views and local opinions. And also the multiple authors. I don't know how many people actually wrote for the paper, but it must be in the hundreds. And each one, contributed an aspect of local knowledge that others didn't know about, and experiences which became an established record over an extended period. So just writing something about an event that happened this week, in 10, 20, 30 years' time is of great interest to historians, which is really the final point about community newspapers. They may appear ephemeral and used for wrapping your chips on a Friday night, but when kept in archives and when consulted over time, you get a massive an in-depth record of events and people's experiences, which can be of great interest and relevance to researchers and historians. So I think although newspapers of this kind may be ephemeral, maybe of the moment and considered to be of limited interest to people outside the area, they do have they provide a massive store of knowledge and experience which can be drawn on by historians, and I think is a good foundation for local history. And Tudor Allen and others in the archive keep a massive record of images, photographs and papers, which I'm sure a lot of historians are using all the time. So that's really our summary, and we're very much able to answer any questions. Just to say that you can look at the 50th issue online at that. If you just Google, I think, Fitzrovia News 50th anniversary edition, you will find it comes up, but it is on the Fitzrovia News website. And paper copies are available outside the Fitzrovia Community Centre at 2 Foley Street. We can't organise and run a mail order process, I'm afraid. There are a few copies left, and there is a box outside the community centre which you can access at any time, 24 hours a day or night. So please pick up a copy or look at it online and enjoy the read. I think I've gone out of our way to select articles that we think developments over and give a reasonable impression in 60 pages of events and writing that's of lasting value and lasting interest. So thank you very much. We're more than willing to answer any questions that you might have.
That was a marvellous account of such an invaluable publication in that area. And I was one of the people who have literally read it every time it came in local studies. I fortunately was able to work in Fitzrovia for a while, and it was my first introduction to the area. I was employed by Camden, but studying to be a librarian at the time, and I got a 2-month holiday job working at IBM's headquarters in the library there in Mortimer Street.
Oh, right.
One of the perks of that really was luncheon vouchers. In those days, luncheon voucher, you could eat in so many restaurants locally, whereas today, I must admit, I see it in all the good food guides as some rather more expensive restaurants. But
definitely.
Anyway, over to questions for anyone who would like to speak. Unmute yourself if you would like to speak. Let me see.
Somebody's got a hand up.
Sorry.
If I help you out here, Adam Samuel. First of all, it's an absolutely brilliant publication. Let's start with the basics. And it does all the things that was just said a few moments ago that it does. But you've got a problem, a real dilemma now. I fully understand why you went remote, but the problem is, how are you going to tell everybody about yourself so that people will actually log in, find your website and get through and read what is actually a pretty good paper? That's the first point. Second thing is, one of the elements, which I suppose comes under the first bullet point of your last slide, that was fantastic about the Fitzrovia News during the pandemic, and just around that time, was its ability to let organizations tell people when they wanted help with volunteers to do various things. And if that could be, I don't know, there's no point in making it a standing item if nobody actually needs any help or volunteers. But if one could get the message out to the various charities and organizations, community organizations who need help, that this is a way of telling people, that would be brilliant. Because right at the start of the pandemic, the soup kitchen got into difficulties because its local sponsors all shut down. And it was great because people like me could tell someone, well, this is an outfit that needs some support, and that it became forthcoming as a result. I think that's one for Linus, probably.
Yes,
I think it is.
I think Linus, he has ways of distributing information about the website. Linus, your invaluable use of social media.
I mean, Adam makes a good point. People do look for a printed newspaper for information, which is one of the reasons we still produce this rather flimsy A4 sheet. It's a lot to do to produce. It's no longer cheap. It's very expensive. To do what we were doing 5 years ago would cost about £2,000 an issue, and it was extremely time consuming. The other thing is, I actually got repetitive strain injury laying out the paper when you're laying out columns of text, something I don't get when producing the website. It's a good point. I mean, a lot of people, I was quite surprised, didn't read the Fitzrovia News anyway, even when we delivered it to their doors. A significant significant number of papers I used to find the next day after delivering them blowing down the street. Well, why aren't people reading this? We're going to a huge amount of effort to do all this, and they've been thrown away. I mean, a lot of stuff is online, and most people find our website by searching. I think, a lot of people do that nowadays. As far as the information exchange about, volunteers and stuff like that, we do have a sort of regular community a neighbourhood listings column, which I put in the printed newspaper, and I've actually now put this on the website. It's community organisations in the area, Age UK, the nurseries, the 2 nurseries, the school, and stuff like that, and including the soup kitchen as well. But please, just email me and let me know what you think should be included. I haven't forgotten about the article you offered to write. I just my inbox has been For those who don't know, Adam Samuel has a very detailed knowledge of the area and has offered to write a very detailed feature. I won't say what it is. It will give the game away. It'll be a nice surprise when you read it in the near future.
Wow.
When we eventually publish it. So yeah, difficult question to answer. We can't force our readers to read the paper, even when we shove it under their noses. Perhaps we ought to be a bit more assertive. I don't know.
Right. It's interesting, while you were talking there, I had an email from one of the people who's actually in the audience tonight. I don't know whether, Charles Brents, you would like me to mention it, or whether you would like to speak on it yourself. What do you think? No, you haven't unmuted yourself. It was a reference that he sent me. He sent me a copy of something from the Liverpool Daily Post, the 23rd of September, 1936, where in that article, it refers to that colony of Soho known as Fitzrovia.
Oh, that's
really?
good.
So I can forward this.
Yes,
So
please.
this is much, much earlier than Dryburgh was supposed to have said it.
Mm,
Gosh. Thank you,
mm,
Charles.
interesting.
Right. Are there any other comment? Anyone else? Oh, right. Ruth?
And I should say that I started following your website and the Fitzrovia news online when we were preparing the streets of Fitzrovia, and I happened to come across, I can't remember exactly what the reference was, but as a result of that, I have subscribed to your however many weekly, is it fortnightly news information, and it's incredibly useful keeping up with the sorts of information that is available, and it's a brilliant resource, I must say. So thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Anyone else that I can see? Speak up if you want to talk, otherwise.
Ellen Ramsey wants to speak.
Well, yeah.
Oh, but she's
Oh,
muted.
Ellen, can you unmute yourself?
There we go. Can you hear
Speaking
me?
from Canada.
Yes, from Canada.
Okay, that's great. Yes, from Canada. Now, tell me, I'm very interested in reading this newspaper. From Canada now, is there a sign up on your website where you will deliver it to my inbox? And is there a charge for doing that? How would I access this?
Okay. Do you want me to show you?
Can you explain, Linus?
Okay. So if I share my screen, just a moment.
It's on the last slide, isn't it? Oh, you got it.
Yeah.
Let's have a look. Okay. Right. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So if you just Google Fitzrovia News, you should find this. And if you go to the top here, can you see that? It says newsletter, and if you click on that, you'll be able to sign up by just putting your email. I'm logged in, so it looks slightly different to you, but what you'll get every couple of weeks is my comment, and then pretty much every article that's been published in the last 2 weeks and the latest public consultations. If you're a real news addict, you can subscribe, and I do not advise doing this unless you like a lot of email. You can actually ask for everything that we publish. How do you do that now? So we click on one of the articles. I think, yeah, you've got to you got to click on one of the articles. So you'll see this, follow Fitzrovia News with WordPress, okay? And just put your email address in and you'll get a confirmation, you know, asking if you want to subscribe. You click yes, and then you get a copy of every single article that we publish by email, or at least a summary of it. So there's two ways in which you can get an email newsletter. Most people want to use the this one, which is by a company called Substack. You know, we don't give your email address away to anyone, and you shouldn't get spammed or anything like that. So that's the best way to keep up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Fine. Right. Is there anyone else or no? Well,
Paddy,
one more.
Paddy.
Yes.
It's actually Brian with Paddy, Brian Jarman. Or it's Brian.
Ah.
Okay. So I thought I'd end, if no one else has got a question, with a little quiz question.
Oh.
And it's about a quote. And I thought, I've just looked it up, I thought this quote was from Dickens, but it's not. And it echoes what Nick has been talking about, and Sue, the importance of this first record of daily life in an area. Who said journalism is the first draft of history?
Ooh,
Oh.
good question.
I thought it was Dickens, but it's not.
Oh.
Who is it?
It was
Oh.
Philip Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. And remember, his daughter went on to be a very famous publisher during the Watergate scandal. And he said that in a speech to journalists in London in 1963.
All right.
Thank you, Brian.
Very
That's
appropriate.
very
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it's been an entertaining evening, and really thank you so much, the three speakers, for introducing us to this record. And for those who don't want to look at things online, of course, Camden Local Studies and Library and Archive Centre does have the bound copies back to 1973. I remember collecting them and arranging their binding at the time, and Tudor, I'm sure, has been continued. So it's an invaluable thing, and thank you for providing so much information about the area. I know over the years I often indexed articles from the newsletter, and so others permanently could find them through that system as well. But thank you all very, very much, and thank you for the audience for such a good evening.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you.